If you were here for first service, that was a really good service. Those men did a wonderful job. I commend them for getting up. You can't hear me back. You need me to move this mic up. How's that? Better? There you go. I was like, I'll hold it. I thought they did a wonderful job. And let me tell you, it's nerve-wracking to get up there. So to get up there and to tell a personal story and personal experience and your own personal spiritual journey is nerve-wracking. And apparently I'm offending people because they're leaving already. All right, so my friend Allie is not here today, my wingman, so we've designated Don as my other wingman today. He's the backup wingman. Last week, we left with a question about the fire of God, and there was a bit of a discussion on that. I said I would do a little research and come back, and one of the questions was, what the different translations of the Bibles used in that particular verse. And believe it or not, I looked at 10 different translations, and 9 of the 10 all used fire of God. The only one that didn't, and I've never even used this translation, was New Century, the New Century version, and that one actually used lightning of God instead of fire of God. So couldn't find anywhere, in the scripture where, lightning was used. That was just their interpretation. So I looked at a lot of other sources to really see if I could find a convincing and I will say Bible-based answer to the question. What was the fire of God in this particular case, right? And I think Don mentioned last week, there were 17 different uses across the Bible where, fire of God was used. I found, but I didn't find anything where in this specific case. So I'm going to go with what Brother Haley says here. He wrote a paragraph about it, and I think his take in terms of how we look at this use of fire of God is probably the safest interpretation in my mind. So in these evils brought upon Job, we see Satan's ability to use men and nature. We may understand how he uses men, but his power to cause the fire of God from heaven to come down and the forces of nature in the great wind to destroy is more difficult. And this is where he says, we can only surmise that somehow through the shifting of man's allegiance from God to Satan, certain powers went with it. Or possibly when God gave Satan permission to try Job, he gave him power to use certain forces in the testing. Anyway, we may look at it, and this is really, the outcome here. We can know that the power exercised by Satan was and is limited by God's permission to use that power, right? So while we don't know, specifically, was it fire? Was it some other, something else from heaven? I think what Brother Haley says there is, at the end of the day, what we can be certain of is God's in control, and ultimately, he may choose to allow Satan to use nature in some way, but at the end of the day, he chooses the what, the when, the where, and the how, right? We were actually, and I'm glad that you said that. That was from, it was Job chapter 1, and we were looking at all the different calamities that Job and family went through, and it was the last one so it was in verse 18. So while speaking there, actually it was in verse 19. So while he was yet speaking, there came another and said, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, and behold, a great wind came across the wilderness and struck the four corners of the house, and it fell upon the young people. So no, that wasn't verse 18. It was in 16. Okay. So while they were yet speaking, there came another and said, the fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you. So it was Job chapter 1, verse 16. Sorry about that. I can't see. All right, so we got all the way through verse 19 last week, And so now we're going to look at and hopefully wrap up chapter 20 here, or chapter 1 here in verses 20 and 21. I think I'm going to kind of try to cover these together, and there's a couple of pieces of the book that I want to share. So I'm going to start off in verse 20. This is after Job found out, about all of the different things that his servants and his children, encountered, and about the death and all the loss of his physical, worldly blessings. So in verse 20 it says, "Then Job arose, tore his robe, and shaved his head, fell on the ground, and worshipped," right? And so kind of going back to Brother Haley again here, he just talks a little bit about what that meant and how we should interpret that, right? So I'm going to read once again verbatim from the commentary here. It says, "Job had listened with shocked silence to the reports of the first three messengers. But now, upon learning the report of the death of his sons and daughters, he demonstrated," and this is where I thought was really interesting, the description here, "he demonstrated in dignified action the deeply felt emotions on his heart. He arose and he tore his robe, an Oriental custom expressing deep grief, a heart rent and pent up with anguish and loss." So that was the first thing. He tore his robe. He shaved his head, a custom that varied with the time and social practices of the people. Shaving may have been it may have been associated with cleansing. Hey, good morning. How are you? "And he fell down on the ground and worshiped," right? And so this is something else that Brother Haley makes. Once again, just interpreting, if we think about, Job here, and we think about what we've studied in chapter 1 and what we'll look at in chapter 2, we're really looking at two things. We're looking at, Job's faith and his response to this loss, right? And then we're looking at, obviously, the interaction between God and Satan and what God allows Satan to do, right? And so Job's reaction, some of the vocabulary that Brother Haley uses is really interesting. And this is what he says kind of at the end here. He says, "There was no indication of despair. Job did not gnash or mutilate his body as did the heathen, but he faced his calamities with all the dignity of one who commits himself that he be judged righteously. He still had God. He could still adore and reverent and rely upon him. The full force of his testing had yet been brought upon him." So, and sorry, I'm having trouble with my contacts, which is why I'm not reading that very well. But at the end of the day, Job lost everything except for obviously his wife at that point, right? And you look at the way he responded to that. It's really an indication of deep faith and a deep trust in God, right? I mean, we all experience loss in some way, right? We all experience at different stages of our life, and how we encounter that. And I know she's not here today, but we often talk about Currie and Brother Allen and some of the losses that they've experienced, right? And you see them, in here week in and week out, extremely faithful, very much, turning to God in prayer. They are a great living example of us of, losing children, losing parents, and they're here, every week in and week out. And every week, Currie is submitting a prayer card, on Sunday nights to pray for her children, right, and to pray for her family. And so, our reaction to, the different struggles and challenges that we, face in life. We get to see this through Job, but there are also examples around us if we pay close attention as well. And actually, as we get into chapter 2, I'm going to share a couple of comments when we get down to verse 6 that I think say a lot about how we look at the challenges we face. So moving on, first of all, any comments on that or any questions before I jump to verse 21? Quiet group this morning. All right, we'll get some comments going. So in 21, it says, and he said, naked I come from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrongdoing, right? So I think we talked a little bit about this. We talked a little bit about this last week, right? So we did spend a fair amount of time, looking at Satan and the interaction there, right? And it's good to understand, how Satan approaches some of the things that he brings upon us, right? Some of the ways that, he wants to cause us to sin and some of the ways he wants to separate us from God. But I think the example we see from Job is one we really need to focus on. And Brother Haley said here about this, kind of close out chapter 1, I thought it was really powerful. He says, in this first test, Job was victorious. He held fast in his faith in God and his providence. He was not overcome to the point of charging God with folly, though he knew not the background of his trials, right? So Job, at this point, had no idea, why all this loss occurred, right? He had no insight into why, all this happened to him, and he remained faithful. When we know not the background of the underlying causes of our problem in life, let us be cautious that we do not draw unfounded conclusions and unjustly blame God for the trials and evils that we must face and meet in this life, right? I thought that was a really powerful way to close out the chapter. Because, going back to, Currie and Alan, right? They face many trials, and sometimes you just search for answers, right? And when we all face trials, we search for answers, and those answers oftentimes are not there for us, right? And all we can do is trust that God has a plan, and that, at the end of the day, he works, for the good for all those who follow him. Yes, sir.
Verse 22, we just read it, and we say, that's Job. But we need to look at that verse and think about how does it affect each one of us. And we know that there are those who, somebody died, and the next couple of weeks another person died. We can't comprehend what Job went through. We just talk about him, we say, it's a story. It's not a story. It's real. But how can we today be able to stand what Job experienced? I mean, he lost everything, completely everything.
Yep.
How would we feel if we lost completely everything? What would our reaction be to God? It would be easy for us, even as Christians, to say, it's God's fault.
Absolutely. Especially when we feel like we didn't do anything to deserve it, right? Like it was quote unquote kind of unjustly brought on us, right? And that's why, as we've studied, chapter 1 here, I think that it's good to take a deep dive in Job like this, right? And it's good to talk through, everything that Job experienced and really look at it. Because if there's one thing that's certain in this life, right, we can be certain that we're all going to face loss, we're all going to face trials, and at the end of the day, I mean, we have a wonderful example here of probably, one of the most, severe losses that I can recall reading about in such a short period of time, in the book of the Bible, right? I mean, everything wiped out, and boom, 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 and Job's immediate kind of real-time reaction to it. Frank.
To add what Tony was saying, the fact that the author here notes that Job did not rebel and he did not blame God.
Yep.
So it must be our natural tendency to want to blame God. Otherwise, I don't think we would have said it. This was an exception.
Yeah.
And I know I've done that in the past. When bad things happen, I've both rebelled and blamed God.
Yep.
And which is wrong. I think maybe it stems from a lack of understanding of our relationship with God. Why do we blame God? Do we not understand the nature and the way that God loves us? We must not understand that.
Yep.
Blaming God.
Yeah, it almost makes you think, Frank, like, should the question be not, why God, but should the question be, what do you want me to take from this God, right? And I'm gonna kind of skip ahead here because I thought probably one of the better quotes that I saw, at least of these first few chapters in the book. I'm going to steal from verse 2, but think about it this way. Okay, so think about God's motives versus Satan's motives here, right? We're talking obviously about Job, but Brother Haley says this when you're talking motives. He says God's motive was to save Job through a perfected faith. And he said Satan's motive was to destroy him through a defeated faith, right? And so it can be hard. It can be really hard to think about when we're going through a trial that, God is working to perfect our faith, right? And we heard a little bit about that this morning, right? But for me, it can be equally beneficial to think about the fact that Satan wants us to feel defeated, right? Like Satan wants us to say, why God, right? Like he wants us to question God. He wants us to question, why would God do this to us? Why would this happen to me, right? And instead of, what would you like me to take from this, God? And what can I learn from this? And how can this help me grow closer to you, right? And so I thought that, looking at the two different motives, that when we face trials, God's trying to perfect our faith, right? And in the opposite side of that, Satan is, trying to defeat our faith and ultimately, stand between us and God. Keith.
In the last, I'm going to say, maybe the last 10 years, I think, maybe this is just as we grow older we see this, but I know Currie Williams talked a ton about this. Tad talks about it. And I think we have, in a way, not talked how Satan is. We say he's out and running around like a lion, seeking who can devour. And that's as far as we get with that verse. We don't get into the verse more. But maybe we just haven't talked about how Satan is the giver of all bad stuff. God tells us all good things come from him. But we just don't talk and concentrate on what Satan does do and what he can do. He can use God's fire. He used the wind. And I think if we would just really think about how Satan is out there to eat us up and wants to pull us away, and might help us to throw our faith more towards God, to trust God more, and to not say it's God. Every time some kind of calamity happens, they blame it on God. It's always blamed on God. And maybe it's nature or it's fire or something like that. They blame it on nature, but they go back to Mother Nature and they blame it on God. Without ever thinking that Satan is in this world to destroy us. He can't destroy God. The only thing he can do is keep us from going to heaven. And that's what he wants to do. He's trying with all his might. He'll use our emotions to make us think that God has done that. He might use your hunger to pull you away. So subtle and so easy that we want to blame God. And we've just got to realize bad things don't come from God. Never will. He says he's not going to tempt us. And we've got to believe that with all our hearts. And realize Satan is the one who's doing it.
Yeah, so I'll say two things on that. First, I think great comments, Keith, really good comments, and I'll come to you, Sherry. I was talking to somebody this week, and I can't remember who it was. I don't remember if it was here at church or if it was in relation to the class outside of church. And one of the observations they made, Keith, is, if you go back a few years, we tended to hear a little bit more about Satan, in kind of sermons and classes, etc. And we don't, focus on it as much. And the thing that came to mind for me is, like, oftentimes on social media, you'll see people who talk about saving for retirement, right? And they talk about, well, don't worry about, spending this or spending that. You need to worry about just making more, right? And so if we come in here, every week, and we talk about just being more faithful and a better Christian and, doing X, Y, and Z better. But to your point, we don't look at the other side. So to the retirement analogy, looking at the fact that, you need to look at what you spend, not just what you make, right? And there needs to be some balance there. And so we do often hear a lot of encouraging sermons, classes, etc., on how we can be more like Christ and how we can be better Christians, etc. But I think taking a step back and thinking about the fact that, there are things in the world, Satan, etc., that want to distract us from, always striving to be more like Christ, and just understanding those and how those play out in our lives. And even something as simple as, instead of why God, what do you want me to learn from this God, might help us, grow a little more. Sherry.
When someone brought it up last week about the powers and Satan's over the powers and principalities in this world, and how he would have control over the weather, he'd be able to create disasters. That came from the fire broadcast.
Yeah.
So I thought about that, and I'm thinking, yeah, we think it's God. Well, I do anyways. A lot of times I say, well, God, God's in control of all that. But he is, but what kind of power does Satan have too in order to create calamities?
Yeah, and great point, Sherry. And at the end of the day, what are the things that are brought into your life on a daily basis that can cause distraction from God? And just remember, and we talked about this, I don't know if it was last week or the week before, but at the end of the day, Satan's goal is to separate us from God, right? He wants to separate us from God, and he wants us to lose focus on God, right? And so, what are those things in your life? Whether it be a tragedy or a struggle, but there are other things in life that may not be perceived as a tragedy or struggle that could also be used to distract you from God as well, right? You might perceive them as good. He might perceive them, this is fine, right? I'm doing this or I'm doing that, right? I don't see any harm in it, but at the same time, it could, distract you ultimately from growing with God. So any other comments before we jump into chapter 2?
Got me thinking about Paul talking to Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 6. If you don't mind, I'll read it.
Please do.
Chapter 6, verse 7 and following. For we brought nothing into the world, and we can take nothing out of it. But if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. People who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap, and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge men into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. Some people, eager for money, have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. So this is kind of the opposite side of where Job was, but it's a warning to Timothy to take, I think, from Job and understand, don't get ahead of yourself. Don't try to, get all the things that Job had. God will provide for us. We brought nothing in, and we're not going to take anything out, so don't worry about anything else. Just live your life and let God control it.
Yeah, and that's a hard thing to do sometimes, right? Like, it's a really hard thing to do, right?
Yep.
Especially with the messages that we're bombarded with, on a daily basis. That's very sound advice, and it's great scripture. Another comment.
Sure. I think Satan wants to have us question our faith, but I think actually it goes more than that, at least this particular time. I think Satan is trying to prove to God that everyone has a point where they will cave in, that they will reject God. No matter how blessed they've been in the past or how, they may not have been blessed in comparison to others. But everybody has a threshold that you challenge that, you cross that, they'll pack it in, they'll go. So, and God says, have you considered Job?
Yeah.
So the challenge Satan has and God has is Satan right? Does everybody have a threshold? And no doubt, the world that we see around, the threshold is real low. What's ours? I mean, what's ours individually? What has to happen before we cave in and say, I'm done, I'm out of here? I know Peggy has mentioned that she thinks, and I agree, that some of the, most of, persuasive atheists are former Christians that when you delve into it, their prayers weren't answered, so I'm out of here. You know, this thing must not make any sense. So the threshold there is, you know, I'm sure it's going to be different with everybody, but we have, as Christians, taking Job as an example, we have to make our threshold something that is in line with God, no matter what happens.
Yeah,
So
I mean,
that there is no price on our salvation, no matter what happens.
yeah, first of all, great comments, right? And I kind of go back to, I think asking the question of why, too many times can cause that, person to eventually give up hope or give up faith, right? Because getting the answer to why can be an unending chase, right? Now, if you're looking for the what, right? Like, what am I gonna, what are you trying to teach me here, God, right? What do you want me to do differently? Like, how can my faith be perfected by that? That's a more constructive way to look at it, right? Versus why. I mean, we'll never know the answer to why sometimes, right? Ultimately, but we can learn what, right? And we can grow based on, if we're thinking about what God wants us to take from it. All right, so any other comments before we jump into Peggy?
I just have a spin, and I'm just going to throw this out.
Okay.
When we say Job lost everything, we don't know the age of their children.
Okay.
One of the heaviest hearts as a parent is getting that child to the age where they take God in their heart and they become a Christian. Prior to that age, they go straight to heaven. Something wrong with that? No, nothing wrong with that. Think about everything. Think about the animals. Think about the slaves. Think about the food. Think about the employees. Think about the stress of getting up every day as an entrepreneur and having all those responsibilities. Nothing's wrong with a simpler life. Job said it best. I came with nothing. I'm going to leave with nothing. I'm okay. What a great positive attitude.
No, you're absolutely right. And we're going to see here early in chapter 2 that not everybody, in the Job household looked at it the same way, but you're absolutely right, 100%. So good comments, Peggy, very much. Anyone else before we jump into chapter 2? All right, so I'm going to read actually verses 1 through 3, and then I'll stop for questions and make some commentary. And so the heading here is Satan attacks Job's health. Again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them to present himself to the Lord. And the Lord said to Satan, "From where have you come?" Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro the earth, and from walking up and down on it." And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil?" And this is a pretty key sentence here. "He still holds fast his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him without reason." So question or comments on that or observations before I kind of jump into the 4 or 5 points that I've made. Go ahead, Don.
Kind of back to where we were, kind of visualized. I think of the Chris Christopherson song, "Why Me, Lord? What have I ever done to deserve you to love?" What? We ask the question, why me, Lord, when something wrong? But do we ever say, why me? Why are you blessing me in so many ways?
Yeah, that's a great point. So if you couldn't hear Don in the back, right? So, we often will ask the Lord, why me, in cases of, struggles and trials and when bad things happen to us. But do we ask the Lord, why me, with all the blessings that have been bestowed on us, right? It's easy to ask why when it doesn't go our way. It's not as easy to ask why, when we get what we want or when we have something good happen to us. Bill.
And I wonder if it's a translational issue, but this is God speaking to Satan, and God says, "And still he held fast to his integrity, although you,
Yes.
Satan, incited me, capital M, God, against him to destroy him without cause."
Yep.
God never, I don't know if it's not taking the credit, but God never relinquishes total control. God acknowledges that even though I said you can go do what you want to him, Satan, in chapter 1, God's, this is a very, what does your commentary say about this? This is a very interesting discussion.
Yeah, so it's funny. I've got a couple of, I had a thought on that. So let me kind of capture the other questions as I'm going through the points here. But you're absolutely right, Bill. The 3 words, 2/3 words that really jumped out at me here is, you incited me, right? Like, when you're incited, it means obviously you reacted to something, right? Like, and God didn't have to react, but he chose to react, right? And so that just brings up a whole lot of questions, right? Without a doubt. So any other kind of observations before I go through kind of the points that I made from the commentary here? All right, so I'm going to kind of start off in no specific order. First of all, I think I said this before, but I think it's worth reiterating. Our omniscient God asks the same questions because he knows the answers in advance. So once again, we talked about this in chapter 1. God knew what Satan was doing. God knew where Satan was. But, he asked the question, even though he knew the answer, and it was kind of a setup to the conversation. It's also interesting, and I think I may have touched on this before, but Haley makes the observation from Luke 4:13 regarding Satan tempting Jesus and how he departed from him for a season. So, we had obviously chapter 1 where all the calamities happened, right? And we don't know, exactly the time between, the 2 conversations, right? And everything that unfolded. But obviously Satan came in, we read about the 4 calamities, and obviously he was unsuccessful, so he departed, and now he's back. It's worth noting that on the day, right? So if we go back up to chapter 1, there was a day when the sons of God, so it indicates kind of a fixed point in time, right? And then, I mentioned this before, but I think it's worth mentioning again. Satan was with the sons of God again. He did not approach God on his own, right? So kind of going back to the first, like, there was a set time. He was with the sons of God. He just doesn't have open access to God at any given time. And then, Job responded exactly the way God anticipated in chapter 1. So he repeats the same description of Job's character. So God commends Job, and God takes a dig at Satan here, right? Although you incited against him to destroy him without reason, right? So there's a bit of a dynamic here, right? There's a dynamic of God mentioning that, you incited me, but also God saying, that you wanted to destroy him, without reason. And so the question I wrote, and I don't have the answer to this, but it's something that we should discuss. I think we've talked about the answer, but it's worth talking about it again, right? Was there a reason, right? Was there a reason for this? So God says without reason. What were the reasons why this happened? Did Job do anything wrong? I mean, after this chapter, we're going to see people thought he did something wrong, right? I mean, his friends obviously thought he did something wrong.
It is interesting that God kind of offered him up. Right? He said, "Have you considered my servant Job?"
Yeah. No, you're 100% right. I
I
mean,
don't think Satan was asking.
God chose Job, right? So, I mean, he chose Job, like, why did God choose Job? Kind of going back to the reason. Because he knew his character, and he knew how he'd respond. What else? Do you think, if you think back, I'm just going to ask some questions, right? If you think back, you know, we talk about the fact that Job was one of the greatest men in the East, right? We read that, right? So do you think there was any, you know, benefit at the time in history, and obviously we know the benefit today, right, which we can get into, but do you think there was any benefit at the time in history where God takes the greatest man of the East, he, you know, destroys most of his physical, you know, wealth and blessings, etc., and he remained faithful to him? So could that have been a reason, Peggy?
Yeah, maybe it's not just about Job himself. Maybe it's about the entire region and the people in the region and what they needed. And Job was how God chose to affect so many. What is the purpose of Job?
Yeah, I mean, there could be, once again, right, we're just talking here, right? There could be, this could have been a wonderful example, you know, to all those at that time, and we all know the blessings we're getting from digging into it today, right? But there were obviously reasons. So it says without reason, but God has, you know, God obviously, to Frank's point, he chose Job, right? There was a reason he chose Job, right? He obviously, I'll come to you in just 1 second. I'll come over here, Keith.
Or God knew, I mean, I believe with all my heart, God knew what Satan was up to. And Satan was up to one thing. He wanted to tell God, just my thought about it, that you've created man, but he's not going to make it unless you keep treating him like Job. And so I think Satan was really going to God to tell God, to tell God that just because you're taking care of man, because you're taking care of man, that's the only reason. You've created something that's not going to love you. It doesn't want you. It only does when you give it good. And I do believe that God gives us all these gifts. He blesses us. We have, and Job's a good example. And all of Israel, when they was in God's grace, or when they did what God asked, they were blessed. And the same thing for us. We get blessed, and we're blessed. We're healed. But whatever, the point is that I think God proved to Job in letting him intervene that man will love me and can love me. Maybe they all won't, and that's true. I mean, there's Satan. He's proof. Not all will, but I think Job was trying to throw arrows at God right there at the very beginning.
Yeah, it's kind of the 2 points together, right? So, is there a breaking point, right? I mean, obviously, Satan wanted to prove to God. I'll come to you, Phil, in just 1 second. Satan wanted to prove to God that, you know, man was selfish in nature, and man would only serve him if, you know, if he had all these physical blessings, or he was serving him because of that. And second, you know, because of the blessings surrounding his health, etc. And so, you know, Satan wanted to prove there is a limit, right? There is a point, right? And the reason God chose Job, back to Frank, is because God ultimately wanted to prove to Satan. I mean, God obviously wasn't in this scenario, right? God obviously wasn't going to choose someone that was ultimately going to lead to an outcome, you know, that wasn't going to prove, you know, the point of that. You know, if you are faithful, if your heart is in the right place, if you have that depth of faith that Job has, that, you know, you will rely on God regardless of what happens to you. So there were reasons, right? So he says without reason, right? But there was a reason why God chose Job, and there was a reason why all this happened, right? Bill?
I almost think that it's God is sticking it to the devil. Because here angels were a created being, and Satan couldn't be satisfied, and so he's a fallen creature. And now Satan's trying to say, God, well, nobody's going to really look after you and worship you and honor you. And so here God says, well, oh, really? You know, okay, well, here's an example. And so he's like putting it back at Satan that there are people that now God has created that will continue to worship.
Yeah, and if you go back to, I made this parallel a while ago, right? Like, if you go back to the garden, right? I mean, in the garden, you know, you could say one for Satan, right? In that particular case, he won that battle, right? He tricked Eve into, you know, eating the apple. You know, she brought Adam along. So, you know, in that scenario, you know, Satan got his way, right? He won the heart of man, right? And in this scenario, we look at, you know, God really driving home. And we don't often compare, you know, the garden and what happened in the garden, you know, to Job. But I think it's a good contrast to really look at, right? You know. I saw one other hand. Don.
Somebody had mentioned that this example had been with us for 3,000, 4,000 years. It's encouraged people. Maybe God from the foundation of the earth prepared this, and he knew, I'm going to bless this guy. Maybe this was years ago. I'm going to bless this guy named Job because I'm going to use him as an example. It didn't just happen. It just didn't happen when the devil showed up and this came about. This might have been planned right from the get-go.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's the Lord's world, and he obviously, you know, plans, he puts people in places, you know, at certain times, you know, and certain events happen ultimately to build faith and to ultimately show that God's in control.
Well, basically, turned Job from a man who is known amongst his peers as an upright man and a godly man to a legend. I mean, people have told the story of Job and write about it in the Bible for thousands of years.
Yep.
Now, you know, otherwise, his good deeds may have just died with him.
Yeah, that's well said. Yeah. Obviously, this the fact that God chose Job, and the fact that Job lived, you know, up to the challenge, makes him one of the greater Bible, you know, characters that we read about, you know, all time, right? And so I know we only have a couple minutes here, but we got like 4 verses into this. So jumping into verse 4, then Satan answered the Lord, skin for skin, all that man has, he will give for his life. I'm not going to go into this, but oftentimes there'll be a big discussion about what physically happened to Job and what he was inflicted with. I don't know that that's, you know, particularly relevant, and a lot of it's just speculation. But obviously, we know that, you know, he was inflicted, you know, with some pretty significant, you know, skin disease at the time, right? So I had on page 41 kind of some of the different theories about what it was, but I don't know that it's necessary here. So moving on to verse 5. But stretch out your hand and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face. So once again, Satan's taken it to a certain point where the physical blessings, the material blessings were significantly impacted, and now he believes that the breaking point, you know, is his physical health, right? And so the 2 points I wrote down here is Satan is saying Job gave up his material blessings, including his family, but he won't give up his physical well-being. Basically he's saying, God, he was tested, but was he really tested, right? I mean, that's essentially what he's saying to him. And then in verse 6, and the Lord said to Satan, behold, he is in your hand, only spare his life. And the 2 points I'll make to kind of wrap up this class today is God allowed Satan to take the testing of Job one step further, but God remained in control of how far it went. And once again, he limited Satan's power. And I touched on this earlier, but I think it'd be appropriate. So God's motive versus Satan's motives. And this is one I think hopefully will be, you know, burned upon, you know, my brain forever. God's motive was to save Job through a perfected faith. Satan's motive was to destroy him through a defeated faith. So, you know, as we think about trials, if we think about them, and I know, you know, we often read about in James, you know, trials perfecting our faith, but if we can really focus on, you know, God is trying to perfect our faith. Satan obviously, you know, wants us to have a defeated faith. That'll help. So I hope everyone has a great Sunday, and we'll see you next week at the same time.